7 days at Westminster. Andrew Neil and guests look back at this week in an hour. Our audience is asking the questions now, BBC One, with David Dimbleby.
Tonight we're in Doncaster. Welcome to Question Time. Whether you're watching or listening, welcome to our audience here and to our panel. Tonight, the Conservative Culture Secretary, Sajid Javid, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, the Liberal Democrat peer, Shirley Williams, the writer, Jill Kirby, ex-director of the Centre for Policy Studies, the think tank founded by Margaret Thatcher, and the comedian and film actor, Omid Djalili. I don't think anyone took up my suggestion last week that if you want to comment on this programme, you could send a postcard to BBC Question Time, Glasgow. It was tongue-in-cheek, but you can join the debate, of course, as ever, by text or Twitter. Our hashtag, you remember, BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time, and you can text comments to 83981 and use the red button to see what others are saying. Right. Our first question tonight comes from Julia Winterman, please.
Why can't politicians tell us the truth about the 60% of cuts that are heading our way?
Why can't politicians tell us the truth? You could just have stopped there. About the 60% of cuts that are heading our way. Sajid Javid, we know that you've only had 40% of the cuts that have got to be made if you're going to hit your targets. What are these 60% that's left over?
Well, of course, politicians should tell the truth, not just, as you say here, at all times, because there is this. I still feel quite new to politics. I've been an MP now for 4 years. But there is this sort of perception sometimes that people can't handle the truth. And I think the British people are a lot smarter than that. And they want to know the truth because they can absolutely handle it. And the proof of that is what have we seen over the last 4 years? 4 years ago, our economy was on its economic knees. We had gone through the deepest recession in almost 100 years. We had the biggest budget deficit of any major industrialised nation, and that's why the government was right to make economic recovery its central priority.
She ain't asking about that. She's asking about what's going to happen next.
But it's absolutely linked to that.
So?
Because making the economy a priority meant dealing with the deficit, and that's why right at the start of this government, the government then said, the Chancellor said and others, that we are going to have to go through a period of finding significant savings and cuts to public spending, because if we don't get that deficit under control, our economy will not recover. We won't be living within our means again, which I think is something that everyone wants to see. But also, morally, it's the right thing to do, because this generation shouldn't be consuming by borrowing money and then passing on the bill to the younger generation.
But, Julia, what do you mean,
that's wrong as well.
What do you mean by telling us the truth? You mean you want to know what those cuts are going to be?
Yes, because at the beginning of this Parliament, at the first time, they mentioned the 40% of the cuts, but they're not telling us the 60% of the badness things that are going to happen.
Which we're now told are going to be on a colossal scale, beyond recognition, and according to the OBR, take us back to the 1930s in terms of the share of the GDP.
And the reason we actually know these numbers is because of the OBR, which is an independent body this government set up to precisely provide this kind of information. So we know what the numbers are that we're talking about. We've had a period now for 4 years where the deficit has been cut by more than 50%. And some of you might recall, 4 years ago, there are a number of people lining up to say, if you try to cut the deficit by that amount, in that short space of a time, you will have record high unemployment, you will have an economy that won't recover. There are people saying double dip, triple dip. They were telling us that we were going too far, too fast. They've stopped saying that
now.
But
where are these cuts going to come from? That's the point.
Well, already we've said there will be around 25 billion of cuts over the first 2 years of the next Parliament. Around 12 billion of those will come from welfare. Other measures would be, as you've seen just yesterday from the Chancellor, what we can do with tax avoidance. Another 5 billion was raised that way. There was action taken against banks and using some of their losses from the banking crisis. That's raising 5 billion. So there are ways to cover the gaps. But I'm the first to admit, we can't tell you here today exactly where every penny of cut is going to come from. That is not possible. As we get closer to the election, I think every political party should set out as much information as it can, and we certainly will do that. But one thing that I can say for sure is that there will be more cuts. The British people can handle the truth, because if we want this recovery to continue, we have to repair our economy and we have to make sure we start living within our means again.
Why don't we ask the people about where they want the cuts? Because it seems to me that, first of all, it's great listening to you talk, and I love that we got great discourse. When the actual autumn statement was made, I was watching it live on television, and you had the Speaker of the House saying that the Chancellor should not have to shout, because the MPs on both sides of the House were doing the most amazing impressions of cattle in different varied kind of states of distress before a cull. And they were, Mrr. And in fact, when everyone quietened down, there was one voice that went, Mrr. Is this a way to run? And I think this is why people are asking, do we trust these people? And, you know, at the end of the day, it looks like they are playing a game. Let me finish one point. Are they playing a game? Because it seems to a lot of us, it seems to a lot of like public school boys, people from private schools, people in the upper middle classes who are playing a game, but they're playing with our lives. And what's the game? They're playing a game of how to keep in power. That's what's going on. Right.
Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, Julia's question was about can we have the truth about what's happening. Actually, the Prime Minister said only very recently that, in fact, 80% of the cuts had already happened, and that was clearly wrong, as the Office of Budget Responsibility has said today, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said today. Instead, what they're doing is proposing spending cuts that would take us back to the 1930s, because they have missed their deficit target, but they've also missed what they promised on increasing living standards, and those things are linked. The reason that they are borrowing far more than they planned, £220 billion more than they planned, is because people are much worse off. £1,600 worse off than they were in 2010. We've seen more people on low wages. We've seen more people paid less than the living wage. We've seen increase in zero-hours contracts. We've seen living standards drop month after month after month. So, of course, people are earning less, so they're paying less tax. So those two things are linked. The deep unfairness, the out-of-touch way that people are being left behind, and also what's now happening to the deficit. And I think this is the worst of all worlds. We've always known that what they were doing was deeply unfair. We've always known it was deeply... We've always known it was deeply out of touch. They do it at the same time. They do it at the same... Just a minute. They do it at the same time as saying that we're all in this together. And in fact, they still want this £3 billion tax cut for the millionaires, for the richest people in the country. I think it is deeply unfair. It's bad for Britain.
I think the big problem with what Yvette is telling us is that actually the amount that the Chancellor has borrowed is slightly more, just slightly more, than Alistair Darling was planning to borrow. Now, I do not excuse the Chancellor, because he promised that he would cut the debt. And Nick Clegg, who was in it with him, said they were going to wipe the slate clean. And that simply hasn't happened. This is like some guy who says he's going on a diet. He tells you he's going to stop spending money on junk food. He's going to get rid of 5 stone off his weight. A couple of years later, he comes back and says, actually, I've put on a few pounds and I'm still spending rather more, but in 2 years' time, I'm going to be really slim. I'm going to get rid of 3 stone and it'll all be gone and things will be great. Please clap. And that's what the Chancellor is saying. He's saying, I've totally failed to cut the debt. The debt has gone on growing. The deficit, year by year, within 1 year, looks a bit smaller, and he's saying the deficit's going to be totally gone because he's going to carry out 60% of cuts when we've only had 40. Sajid can't tell us, and nor can the Chancellor, what those will be. You're quite right. He doesn't know where they're going to come from. I don't believe he's going to carry them out. I don't believe he's going to wipe out the deficit. He's certainly not going to clear any of the debt. The debt is growing day by day by day. The government borrows £25,000 for every man and woman in this country.
So this idea of returning to the 1930s is a fantasy, really. It's only if he wanted to cut the deficit that we'd be back in the 1930s
How
with
is
these
he
colossal
going
changes.
to cut
You
that
don't believe
much
it can be
of
done?
public spending if he's going to ring-fence the NHS budget?
Right.
The welfare budget can't shrink by anything like that amount because of the cost of pensions. There's just no prospect.
But it's worse than that, because what he's also said is he wants £7 billion of completely unfunded tax cuts. He hasn't said anything about where that's going to come from. And actually what's probably going to happen, he's probably going to end up with even deeper spending cuts, or alternatively putting up VAT, which was what he did last
But
time.
would Labour get rid of the deficit within this period or not?
We've said that we should you've got to pay down the deficit, you've clearly got to. We should balance the books by the end of the next Parliament. Do it as early as you can, but do so in a fair way, and that means three things.
Are you going back to the 1930s like this?
No, definitely not. No, absolutely not, and I think it would be wrong to be so.
How she's actually going to cut the deficit. How are Labour going to do it? They have opposed every single spending cut we have put in front of Parliament. She talked about taxing the richest. The richest, the top 1% in our society today, pay 27% of all income tax. That's the highest proportion they have ever paid in our history. The top tax rate is higher in this Parliament than in every single year that Labour was in office. So you don't have a plan.
Because we put
you
it
have
up
no
at
idea
the end
how
of
to
the
help
last Parliament. What in fact you've done, Sajid, is you have cut taxes for the richest people in the country by £3 billion.
I just think that is wrong. I've just told you the richest pay more than ever before.
Let me bring Shirley Williams in.
Hold on. And you chose to do so. It's deeply unfair.
Let me bring Shirley Williams in. The question being, why can't the politicians tell us the truth about the cuts?
Well, first of all, I think Julia's being unfair. I mean, whether one likes it or not, the Chancellor, in the autumn statement, was very precise about the figures. And I think that the Conservative government deserves credit for bringing in OBR, the budget responsibility.
She's shaking her head as she listens to you.
She shouldn't shake her head, because it's true. The OBR has recognised throughout the press, throughout the media, throughout the universities, doesn't matter what their politics are, left, right, centre, they all recognise the OBR has fought very hard indeed to tell the truth. And I think
Gordon Brown just used to fix the numbers.
I think it's a great shame when the usual argument that all politicians are liars gets given by Julia, and intelligent woman like Julia, the credence that isn't right, because on this one, the government has tried to play it straight. However, I do share some of Yvette's view, because I think although I think Labour needs to come much cleaner about how it will deal with the deficit, I agree with that. But I think one of the things we have to recognise is that while the Chancellor has come out with a string of extremely attractive ideas, some of them are very interesting indeed and would be shared by all of us on this platform, the money for postgraduates, the attempt to change the stamp tax and all the rest of it. These are very good things. But the elephant in the room is the impossibility of making a 60% cut in the quality of our public services without devastating consequences. And I think, therefore, the short term is it being addressed very honestly by the Chancellor. I think the real worry comes in the middle term, where you're trying to cope with 60%. And I agree with Yvette that one of the big mistakes is to suggest that we can therefore also afford very substantial tax reductions. And I should add also, the Prime Minister has talked about a surplus, which can only be used for the tax cuts.
So this deficit, you don't really think it can be abolished within the next Parliament?
Well, only at too high a price for the public service.
All right, let's hear from one or two members of the audience. Got a number of people with their hands up. You up on the right there, sir.
There seems to be a cruel sense of irony when, you know, as we've already established, people are borrowing more money than ever. And then when the cuts were announced, there seemed to be a pseudo-silver lining. Oh, we're going to make it easier for people to buy houses. With what money? How can they do that when they're already borrowing too much? OK, and the woman here in the second row.
Yeah, my concern is about being genuine and honest about where these cuts are coming from. I mean, having worked in the public sector for many years, you see already the impact of the cuts over the last 4 years on the most vulnerable in our society. And that my concern is I want to know from the politicians where the cuts are coming from before the election, so I can then make an informed choice about who I'm going to vote for.
And do you think...
The question, young lady.
Yes.
I just want to ask you one question, because I think one of the problems politicians face is the belief that suggesting any increase in taxation is wildly unpopular, and therefore they won't carry the election, however well their intentions are. Would you accept tax increases to pay for public services?
Absolutely, I would, because working day in and day out with the most vulnerable and needy,
right.
I'm more than happy to pay more in my tax bill to make sure that children are protected and that we can provide the services to the disabled and the most vulnerable.
Huge credit for that.
No, the second row from the back there. Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, we were told at the start of this current term by, I think, Mr Cameron, that the austerity measures that were going to be implemented would get rid of the deficit. Where's the truth in that? That's clearly not happened.
Do you want to answer his point?
Yes, what the gentleman is referring to is we talked about the independent OBR. The OBR forecast that the deficit, back in 2010, they said the deficit should be complete, the deficit reduction, by the end of this first Parliament. Now, if you're going to use the OBR's numbers, as you just did, sir, then you also have to look at why they have said it hasn't happened. And what they said in 2012 was that the reason the reduction pace has stopped or slowed down was because of the Eurozone crisis was much deeper than anyone had imagined. There was a big fall in growth in some of the largest economies in the world, like China and India, and commodity prices had risen sharply. So if you're going to use their numbers, you also have to use their reasons.
Well, don't promise something that can't be kept, then.
It was a number from an independent body.
And actually,
the reason... It's a forecast, and you shouldn't trust forecasts.
Well, what they said today was that the reason that there's been a big drop in the tax receipts compared to what they were expecting was because so many people are still on low pay. People's living standards have not gone up. And that's why, look, in the long run, what you've got to do, because you're right, you've got to say, how are you going to get the deficit down? We said that does mean some spending cuts, and we've set out some areas where you could do that. It does mean a fairer approach to taxation. So it means, for example, having a mansion tax in order to pay for extra investment for our National Health Service, which we really badly need. And it means getting the economy growing in a way that everybody benefits, and not just those on the highest income benefiting. If you get those right across the economy feeling better off, so they're earning more, support more free childcare so that you can have parents can actually manage more hours in work, do more to help increase the living wage, increase the minimum wage so that people are being paid more, do more to boost apprenticeships, get the economy growing. So we've got to do all three things together. Well, we've said the childcare would be paid for by a bank levy. We've said in each area...
that 10 times over. You can't spend £2 billion on 20 billion on products.
The investment in the National Health Service would be paid for by a tax on the highest value properties. So we have said exactly where the money would come from. I think it's the right thing to do.
What are you actually going to cut?
The deficit, will it?
Well, so we've
what are you actually going to cut?
Well, I'll tell you one really good example that we would cut in the Home Office budget is we would cut police and crime commissioners. Let's abolish them and put that money in.
And how much is that going to save you? How much is that going to save you? The deficit is 90 billion. How much is it going to save you?
Within the Home Office budget, that would mean we wouldn't have to cut 1,000 police officers next year, which is what Theresa May is going to have to do. So you can do.
If you're not going to cut anything, you're going to raise taxes. And why don't you tell people the truth?
Actually, no, we've actually said more about where we would make savings like that than the question.
Yvette, apart from what you said, I think in all fairness you should admit that there has been an increase in the threshold at which you start paying tax. And in this country, more than almost any other country in Europe, we start taxing people awfully early on.
Well, the problem is, that's certainly true, and the personal allowance has gone up, but the problem is that actually people on low income have been hit very heavily by tax credits being cut. They've also been hit heavily by VAT. And again, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said overall, those families are being hit by nearly £1,000 a year, as a result of just the tax and benefit changes, and women are being hit 3 times harder than men, even though they earn less and own less than men. I just think that is unfair.
Jill Kirby, do you think the target of reducing this deficit within the Parliament, which the parties all seem to agree on, is the right target? Or is there an argument for not doing it and therefore not having us go back to the 1930s as the Office for Budget Responsibility says will be?
There's a very powerful argument for the government spending less money because we are borrowing huge amounts of money and growing £1.4 trillion of debt, as I said, and debt interest has to be paid. Now, interest rates are quite low at the moment, but even so, the debt interest is costing more than the education budget. This is a criminal waste of money, and this government promised, when it came to power and the great coalition was formed to deal with this problem of debt, to start living within our means, to actually start exporting and rebalancing the economy. None of that has happened, and I think George Osborne needs to admit more freely that he has failed in his objective, which was to govern differently, to think seriously about what government should be doing and how governments are wasting your money all the time. You might feel OK about giving them a bit more in tax, but are you confident they would spend it well? Because I'm not. And I think that governments spend people's money very badly. They grow departments, they add more ministers, they put more people onto big salaries. Money is poured into the health service and it goes in £1 million payoffs. It's a very bad way to use people's hard-earned money. So we shouldn't trust government to spend on our behalf, and we should hold them to account. And actually telling us that the OBR has got independent figures is no consolation. If you have the OBR telling you before the end of the year you haven't hit a target, then you think about how you can reach it. You don't just say, well, never mind.
But Jill,
it'll be another few years.
Are you very much in favour of small government? Is that why you'd like to see
much smaller government? Yes.
Two-thirds cut
the
off
government
the departments.
we should not be borrowing at this rate
well, hang on,
to fund
two
government
things.
activity.
There's big government and little government, and there's borrowing. Now, you seem to be in favour of little government, and that's fair enough.
And less borrowing.
Position.
And less borrowing.
Well, not necessarily, because if you look at the United States, which is largely not the public sector on the scale that we are, well below the scale, it has huge problems with debt as well.
Yeah, but they have seriously cut their deficit. They've done the things that this government said it was going to do.
If you look at their figures,
they have a much more balanced economy. They have recovered and got a balanced economy. They're exporting their services.
But Shirley, you seem to be coming to the defence of George Osborne and of the coalition on the economy. Osborne himself said today that the Liberal Democrats, remember, Nick Clegg wasn't even there in the House of Commons yesterday.
I wasn't defending, if I may make the distinction.
Can I just make the point? He said the Liberal Democrats sign up to government spending plans in private but slag them off in public. Is that true?
No, it's not true. I can tell you a precise quotation from Nick, which we checked out with the Cabinet minutes. Twice he was told by the Chancellor that they would not have cuts or not increase the threshold at which people start paying tax. And the Chancellor said quite precisely to him, we're not in the business of having a Lib Dem budget. Now, in fact, they have adopted elements of the Lib Dems, not only the elements about the threshold, but also a great deal of the stuff about the punishing of banks that cheat, the decision to include the multi-million companies in the decisions to try to stop people who are non-DOMs getting away with not paying any tax, and the mansion tax, which is Labour but also Lib Dem policy. All those things are to do with trying to protect the people from unfair and I think, often very ruthless exploitation of the kind that we've seen from, I dare not mention the firms or I get in trouble with libel, but you know and I know what they are.
You, sir, in the front here.
MPs' expenses of roads in excess of 5 million in the last 5 years. When are the politicians going to take their share of the cuts?
No, Omid, do you want to answer?
From what I can tell from what the people are saying is that there's a real concern that after this latest autumn statement that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I think that's the main worry we have.
I agree.
And on top of that, this lady has just said that she's happy to pay something for something that meant a lot to her. So if we're talking about cuts, I wonder if we just ask the people. We had a referendum in Scotland, and there's never been more people by having a referendum. When we have to have cuts, why don't we ask the people what they prioritise, what they think is prosperity, and let's let them say, OK, we'd rather have cuts more from the roads and more into the NHS. There must be a system where we ask the people rather than, I know we vote in a government, but there's obviously trust lost that we can actually trust the government to do the things with our money. So there must be a way of getting the people to decide what cuts are made.
I'm going to take a couple more points from members of the audience, and then I'll go on. You, sir, there, who had your hand up before. Yes.
I'm frustrated. The father of 3 adult voting children, I can't get them to vote. They never have voted. My eldest is 26. And I talk to them about politics, because I'm passionate about politics, and they don't get it. They don't get what's in it for them. My wife doesn't. I think I've actually got a better chance of getting my dog to vote in the next general election than I have of any of my family and my siblings.
Why do you think 79% of the Scottish people, including young people, voted in the Scottish referendum? What's the difference? What do we need to do?
Because they felt there was something to vote for. There was a clear distinction between yes and no. Whereas at the moment, you're all saying the same, and it's just a blah, blah, blah.
The same thing here.
One more point there, yes.
We're on about a referendum for... the Conservatives are on about a referendum for Europe if they win the next election.
Yes.
Like Djalili has just been saying, Why can't we look at a referendum in terms of, for the NHS, for putting up taxes, do the general public, why can't the general public have a say and have a referendum on that? Are people willing to pay an extra penny in the taxes to save and protect the NHS?
An election doesn't work for you. An election where parties set out their proposals, that doesn't work?
No.
OK. And the woman here, and then we must go on to another question, because time is pressing.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're just getting too divided, and it's like rich against poor, and it shouldn't be like that. If, you know, while people have been taken out of tax, they've had their benefits cut as well, so they're not actually any better off, and they would have been just better actually doing something about the low wages and the high rents, you know, instead of dropping tax for some people because they don't feel it in their pockets. You know, if you change VAT, that would help everyone. You know, if you lowered VAT rather than, you know, subsidising big companies because they don't want to pay a
Let me just
wage.
end by going back to Julia. You've heard what's been said by all the politicians on this panel. Has it changed your view, or do you still think people don't explain things as clearly as they should, or perhaps don't know what it is that's going to happen?
I don't think they do explain it as it should be. They're not telling us the truth. And I don't mind paying extra income tax if it's going to go to the NHS and to the you know, people that's disabled and that. It's got to go to the right places.
But you want to have it spelt out?
Yes.
OK. Let's go on to another question. Patrick Rowe, please. Patrick Rowe.
What is the future for the British identity after a recent survey showed in some areas of England the most popular typical British names have been replaced with those of Islamic origin?
This was a curious report this week that Mohammed has become the most popular boy's name in the United Kingdom. What is the future for the British identity if that is so? Yvette Cooper.
Well, Britain's always been a diverse country, and we saw in the Olympics we have people who over very many centuries have come from all over the world to be part of Britain. You go back to the Norman Conquest or the Vikings or the Huguenots or more recent migration, and that's the kind of country we've always been, and I think we should be proud of our diversity as well as being proud of our British values, because I think you can be a diverse country and also have very strong British values which are about fairness, about a sense of responsibility and duty, and about recognising both our sort of freedoms and the sort of respect for equality that we have across our country. So I think you can have both British values. I think the names that children have, names change with every single generation. I don't think that's about British identity. I think British identity is about our values and about our confidence and being an outward-looking country.
Patrick Rowe, what were you getting at with the question?
I suppose I'm not sure what it is to be British anymore. If my children asked me what are typical British values, I couldn't really tell them. If my father's generation, I'm sure he could tell me what it was to be British, but I think what it is now is evolving. I'm not really sure what it's evolving into.
And the use of and the number of Mohammed being the most popular boy's name suggests to you what exactly?
I think
doesn't mean there are more.
I think migration is in some areas it just seems to have gone a little bit explosive. And the numbers of what people have been migrated to, it doesn't seem to have been integrated properly, and it just seems some cultures are sticking to some cultures and people are not really spreading, and we're not having one diverse country, it's just everywhere sticking to their own people.
It's very interesting.
Omid,
for me, it's very interesting that a story like this has come out and it's been fed up by sources like the Daily Mail, who are probably pushing out an idea where there are already forces out there that are trying to be divisive. I know if you're talking about British values, in Doncaster here, my father had two of his sisters were moved to Doncaster, and we're talking about British values. They were so well integrated. They were so... We were out playing football on Town Moor, and I used to come and visit them. And in fact, my aunties who came here, within a couple of years, they're all talking like that. They said, all right, Omid, come here, lad. And I think that's British values. So for me, the name Mohammed, also maybe they're asking a lot of Asian people, because if you watch kind of Arabic football, it's like Ahmad passed to Muhammad, Muhammad goal. Oh, what a goal. Let's speak to the manager, Muhammad. What a great game. Well, thank you, Ahmad. I'd like to dedicate that goal to my wife, Muhammad Ahmad, and my newborn son, Ricky Martin. So we've got to be careful where these stories are coming from.
OK, you, sir, up at the back there.
I think it's really dangerous to link this term I'm not very comfortable with, British values, with a name, because, well, for example, I lived in Germany for a year. My name is Ben or Benjamin. Not a common name in Germany, but I was completely accepted there. My girlfriend's Polish, she's living here, Agnieszka. That doesn't mean that she doesn't, you know, abide by the laws here and, you know, well, yeah, she fits in absolutely fine. So I think it's really dangerous to just, you know, take a name.
Do you think there is
value.
such a thing as a British identity? Do you feel there is or not?
Difficult one just to label, that's the thing.
OK.
I mean, I've lived in Britain all my life, and I'm proud to be from here, but then to just distinguish, you know, the people either not welcome or welcome just by their name is completely wrong.
OK. And you, in the middle.
I'm called Mohammed, so
you're called Mohammed.
I just find it weird if someone's going to judge me for being called Abdul or Ben or Robbie or something like that. Shouldn't you just judge me for who I am instead of just labeling me for a name?
And you said that, yes.
I think if you drill down into this story, you'll see that it was a fairly self-selecting group that actually did the reporting, and the name Mohammed came out of a very small survey, and as Omid said, it became a little bit of a Daily Mail type story, more to separate us and I suppose draw us together. It is a bit of a non-story, I think you'll find.
Yes. There are official statistics that say it ranks high, the name Mohammed, and I don't know, comes 15th, but if you put in every way of spelling it, apparently it climbs up. There are so many different ways of spelling it. What do you think, Jill?
Well, I think I don't think the poll helps us very much. I mean, Mohammed, in whichever way you spell it, is a very popular name of choice. As a Muslim name, we don't really have the equivalent. You know, we don't call every other boy in the family Jack or Harry. I mean, there are names that are put, there's a wider range of names. So that's kind of rather throwing in a different element to the question. What you're getting at, I suppose, is do we feel that everybody in this country shares some kind of common identity, regardless of what they're called? And I think, you know, the point that's worrying you is that you sense that there are areas where actually people who have the same racial or ethnic background only really want to be with each other and socialise together and share a language and don't necessarily want to share the values of everybody else around them in the country. And that means that we do have a bit of a loss of British identity. What people come to this country for, we hope, is to be part of that British identity. You know, I've read Sajid's backstory. His father came here, and in the same way that Omid's family are very much part of what's happening in this country and see themselves as British, I'm sure. But if you come to the country and you feel you can't cope with the language, or nobody bothers to teach it to you and just translates everything for you, and you just withdraw into a small group of people who just look like you and sound like you and have precisely the same norms, you're not going to have the benefits of coming to this country, which are the things that we, you know, draw the world towards us for, because of the sense of fairness and values and welcoming openness. That is what Britain is about. It's not about actually sealing people up in little boxes and creating, in effect, ghettos. So, yeah, it's very, very important that we integrate, and language is one of the most important ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be the shared names, but certainly we should all be speaking English and understanding English and expecting everyone who comes here to want to be part of that. Right. Certainly as a first point of contact.
Sajid.
Yeah, I have a number of friends actually called Mohammed. I have one friend in particular, I just thought when Patrick mentioned that is a soldier in the British Army that's fought for our country a number of times. And I can think of, you know, Amjads and Abduls and others that fight for our country. Recently, we commemorated the First World War, the start of the First World War. Over 40,000 Indians in the British Army lost their lives defending our way of life and defending our freedom. And with all due respect to Patrick, I think it's pretty silly to suggest that someone's name has some kind of bearing on their love for our country. I'm called Sajid. I'm fiercely patriotic about our country. I think it's the greatest country on earth. And so I think name has nothing to do with it. I think where you have a serious point, absolutely, is that immigration does have an impact on our country. As Yvette said, that we are a stronger country, I think, because of immigration. I think it's one of the things that makes us great, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to control it. And in recent years, we lost control. In the last decade, we had almost 2 million people come to our country, which was almost equivalent to the previous 40 years. And that means we lost control. And what we need to do is control our borders, and that's what the Prime Minister was talking about last week with respect to EU immigration. But also, just as important, we need to make sure that people that do settle in our country respect our way of life and respect our country by, for example, making sure they speak English. So that's what I'd like to see.
Patrick, do you want to come back on this? You've heard a lot of explanations. Are you happy with what you've heard? You haven't heard from Shirley yet.
I wasn't actually intimating that the name was saying if they're a good or bad British person. I just think that typically in the past, say, 20, 30, 50 years, people thought of English, generally people being Church of England, and maybe Islam, Muslim is taking more hold as a religion, and that's why the country is sort of, I don't know if it's evolving or less people are interested in religion, or it certainly feels like it's changing to the England that my parents grew up in.
Shirley Williams.
Well, it is, and that's what's happened in the last 30, 40 years. I have to say that as somebody who's lived through that whole period since I was probably the oldest member of this panel, I think Britain has become a much more exciting and colourful and imaginative place than it used to be. So I'm very strongly in favour of there being something of a mix of people. Where I think I probably have both agree with Sajid but then disagree with him, I agree completely about the fact that it's only very recently that we've realised how huge have been the sacrifices made by the Commonwealth in the various wars this country has fought. I mean, quite incredible. People forget it. Everybody remembers the Australians and Canadians, and quite rightly so. But then when they discover that the Indians lost as many people as the Canadians and the Australians, they tend to think they had nothing to do with the First World War or the Second, and they had a great deal to do with it. The point at which I think I probably would worry a bit about what Sajid said is that if you're going to restrict immigration, and we probably will as a country because we're a heavily populated country, we ought to be very clear about the reasons why people have the right to come here. And I have to say that I think one of those reasons, it reflects, I think, back to what Yvette said, is that people with strong cases for asylum because they have stood up for democracy, for what you might call British values, in other parts of the world against dictators and so forth, ought to be among those that we allow to come to this country. Otherwise, what we end up with is oligarchs and oligopolists. I think we can do without them.
OK. We'll move on. Move on. Rebecca Sambrook, please. Rebecca Sambrook.
Having stepped down as an MP, do you think history will favour Gordon Brown?
Gordon Brown has announced he's not going to stand against the House of Commons. Will history favour him? Jill Kirby.
Well, I hope not, or at least I hope history will tell the truth. And we've heard a lot about truth-telling tonight. There's one thing I would congratulate Gordon Brown for, one decision he made, which I think spared us a lot of pain we would otherwise have suffered, and that was when he decided not to take Britain into the euro. I'll give him credit for that, but that's where it stops, because throughout his period as Chancellor and then his brief and inglorious period as Prime Minister, he wrecked the country's economy. He took us from a point where actually we had a thriving, balanced economy. In the early years, he took on the Conservative legacy of a well-managed country, well-managed finances, and then he proceeded to squander it, to sell off our gold at rock-bottom prices so we had no reserves to fall back on, to borrow frantically when we didn't need to borrow, when actually the country should have been preparing for bad times. He was just borrowing and spending, expanding his huge tax credits regime so that more and more people became welfare dependent, and essentially being so caught up with the idea of becoming the Prime Minister he felt Tony Blair had cheated him of becoming, then he just threw money out, hoping that it would get him into power and that actually he had as he put it, seen an end to boom and bust. He thought the bubble that he'd inflated in the city and elsewhere would just go on growing. And that was a very dangerous and imprudent, for all his alleged Scottish prudence, very reckless thing to do. And so I think history must be truthful about the damage that Gordon Brown did to our economy, with one exception, that had he gone along with Tony Blair and got us into the euro, we would have been in a far worse situation than we are now.
Shirley, yes, you want to come in?
Well, I know Gordon Brown, and I think that's profoundly unfair.
Sorry, it's the truth.
No, it's not true. It's not true. I think Jill, with respect, completely forgot about the banking crisis.
No,
the banking crisis wasn't invented by Gordon Brown. You may remember something called Lehman Brothers. You remember something called the Royal Bank of Scotland. You may remember the collapse of parts of Wall Street. You may remember that in 2007, we had a desperate worldwide banking crisis with banks cheating on their customers, borrowing money they had no right to borrow, pretending that they could fix the exchange rates, and they'd just been in prison. They haven't, alas, they should have been. They've just been hauled up for fining for that. And to turn all that into a blaming of one remarkable man is, to me, utterly unfair and unacceptable. Now, I will say two things about Gordon Brown. One, I think he was too friendly to the banking sector. I don't think he realised what they were up to. Then most people didn't realise what some of them were up to. And secondly, I think we have to thank him very much indeed for almost certainly being the main force persuading the Scots to vote to stay in the Union. And for that, those of us who care about Scotland and believe its influence is a good influence, and I very strongly believe that, would be living through tragedy at the moment if there hadn't been a Gordon Brown who had the guts to get up and face the Yes campaign and give all the arguments why the Union should continue.
Rebecca, I'll go to Rebecca. What were you thinking of about Gordon Brown?
Well, I was going to mention the banking crisis as well, and whether people thought, because it's gone quite international now and other people are starting to use the same system, whether that was going to be what people would look more favourably on.
I mean, you think he's having a raw deal at the moment, do you?
Yeah.
In terms of, yes.
Yeah.
Sajid, Javid.
Well, I've been in Parliament for 4 years. I think I've seen Gordon Brown once in the House of Commons, and so one would be forgiven to think he hasn't stepped down already. But the first thing, the nice thing I've got to say about him, because I'm afraid I agree very much with what Ruth just said, is that I respect all MPs of all parties in the sense that they have given up alternatives they could have had, especially like Gordon Brown, who was talented. He was very smart in many ways. And he could have done other things in life, but he decided to dedicate that to public service, so I give him full respect for that. But then we have to hold him accountable for his decisions. And, Shirley was talking about, say, all the banking crisis, and, have we forgotten about that? Let's remember, one of the very first acts of Gordon Brown in 1997 was to take away regulation of our banking system from the Bank of England. And that directly had an impact on the size of the banking crisis. The reason we had a bigger banking crisis than any other country on earth, the reason we had the world's largest banking bailout, £50 billion for one bank. Incidentally, remember the head of the bank, Royal Bank of Scotland? Who gave him a gong? I think he was called Gordon Brown. That happened because of Gordon Brown and the decisions that he took. We talked earlier about the deficit and the damage that's done to our country. The fact that every time we borrow that money, it is mortgaging the future of our young people. That is what Gordon Brown did. He left us with the biggest budget deficit of any major industrialised country, borrowing £5,000 a second, and we are paying for that mess today. And so I think whilst I respect him for giving up his time, he has done a huge amount of damage to our country, and we should never forget that.
Sajid,
hold on, Shirley. Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, of course Gordon Brown didn't get everything right, and no politician ever would, and we should have had stronger regulation of the banking sector. I mean, interestingly, the Conservatives were calling for less regulation of the banking sector in that period. But if you look at all of the things he did, making the Bank of England independent, keeping us out of the euro, the right thing to do, bringing in the national minimum wage, lifting 1 million pensioners out of poverty, the support for the National Health Service, which really was in crisis in 1997, and we got more support for the National Health Service. And yes, as Shirley says, keeping Scotland as part of the United Kingdom rather than allowing our country to break apart. And there's this right-wing view that somehow it was Gordon Brown's public spending that caused the financial crisis. Well, it really was not. Too many teachers, nurses and doctors in our British public services that caused Lehman Brothers Bank in New York to crash. We should stop blaming public servants and blame the banking, the private sector for the financial crisis that was caused.
OK. We had your shadow business secretary, Chuka Umunna, on last week. He said on Gordon Brown's economic legacy, I'm quoting him, his refusal to use the word cuts gave the impression we didn't understand that debt and deficit would have to be dealt with. Do you agree with that?
I think there was a period when, in the run-up to the election, when what we were trying to do was support the economy, and there was a sort of dispute about, you know, what Gordon said and what Gordon didn't. But actually, I think that was missing the point.
It rather goes back to what she was saying about whether politicians will speak.
It does. But I actually think it's missing the point, because I think a lot of that period was about making sure that the Royal Bank of Scotland didn't crash and we didn't end up with the rest of us not able to get money out of the cash points. It was about making sure that the global economy didn't go under. And a lot of the work that Gordon Brown and others did to get countries to work together to stop the financial crisis just destroying a lot of people's savings was really important.
Omid, what did you make of Gordon Brown?
I mean, look, they say he was a flawed individual, but who isn't? We're all flawed individuals. You know, I'd like to think that if I passed away, people would remember me. They'd say, oh, he's a funny guy. And I hope people wouldn't say, but he was an out-and-out racist. Look at some of his comedy. I like to remember Gordon Brown as someone who helped save the Union. I thought he was a wonderful politician. I know that within certain circles they thought he was a bit of a bully, but the people around him were staunchly faithful to him. And I just worry that in history that when Margaret Thatcher passed away, some kids like Harry Styles of One Dimension sent a tweet saying, rest in peace, Margaret Thatcher, and 1 million kids tweeted back saying, who? And I thought if kids today don't remember Margaret Thatcher, then John Major's not going to get a coffin. You know? Gordon Brown is going to be left on the side of a road with a post-it note on his head saying, not Tony Blair. You know, I worry about that, but I think he was somebody who was... I have a lot of respect for him, a lot of love for him, and I think there was a lot made of his relationship with Tony Blair that it was like as if there was some kind of... They loved each other, but like, oh, when can I be Prime Minister? Well, I'm Prime Minister. You have to wait your turn. Oh, when can I be? And I think a lot was made in the press, and I think there's something about our culture here that we like to... Big flaws, like Russell Brand, hypocrite, on the front cover of The Sun. I mean, that was a bit rich coming from The Sun. I just think there's something in our culture that likes to focus on flaws. Why? He was a lovely guy.
You, sir. Yes.
Gordon Brown's not the most charismatic man I've ever seen, but apart from that, I think he did a pretty good job. But why is this government presently selling off the railway that runs through this town from London to Edinburgh when it's contributing about 200 million to the Exchequer, so it's been sold off to private enterprise? Right, well, and I think people have got a short memory if you don't remember what Mrs Thatcher did to this, especially the north, this country, in selling off a lot of the crown jewels that we had then.
OK. And you, sir?
I think the situation is that Gordon Brown, when he came to be Prime Minister, he inherited a very difficult situation. It's the same reason Barack Obama's had these problems. He's not been able to do anything. He was not the man to take care of that. What I'm worried about is the Labour government during that period set up that situation, and since then we've been trying to pull ourselves out of it. I'm a young person, and for the rest of my life now, I believe that I'm going to be dealing with the aftermath of the crisis and the recession. I'm probably not going to be able to get a house. I'm probably going to struggle to get together a decent job because there aren't people employing, people are staying in employment longer because there's no security. And I want to know how I'm supposed to continue with my life, knowing that decisions that were made before I was able to vote, engage in the system, have basically left it in somewhat of a wilderness.
So you have a grim view, really, of the future, of your future.
I'm struggling to be optimistic at the moment, and to be honest with you, I'm not hearing anything from any politicians at the moment, especially considering for the first time I'm going to be able to vote in a general election in 6 months' time. as are a lot of young people who are feeling so disaffected with politics at the moment. We're not hearing anything that's going to get us engaged and is going to make us believe that we want to stay in Britain, we want to do well. I mean, I'm looking to go to America because I believe I can have a better life there.
All right. Sajid, would I just answer that point? Perhaps we'll ask our three politicians here directly to answer it. But briefly, if you would, because I want to get another question before we end.
Opportunities. The more opportunities are for young people, the most, obviously, they can do with that. And what we've seen in the last 4 years, after having a very difficult start, today we have the fastest-growing economy in the developed world. We have over 2 million jobs that have been created over the last 4 years. We have the fastest rate of job creation of any major country.
Does that answer your question?
It seems like rhetoric. I'm not believing that I look at my prospects in life, that they're going to affect me. There are job opportunities coming around, but where are they coming? I mean, 0 hours contracts. What am I looking at there? I mean, that's insecurity. I don't believe that in my life I'm going to have what my parents had. That's go out, I can find a job, I can buy a house, I can put a mortgage together, I can retire. I mean...
All right.
The way I look at it, I'm going to struggle.
Yvette, you can have a brief attempt to win him over.
See, I think when Sajid says it's all great, the economy's growing, there's wonderful opportunities, I just think it shows how out of touch he is, because I don't think that's what most people are feeling.
So there's no hope for him?
No, I think there should be. I think it doesn't have to be like this. It's not just about what happened in the past, it's about what decisions we make now for our future. We don't have to have these exploitative 0 hours contracts. We should abolish them. We don't have to have people stuck on a minimum wage that's not going up. We should be increasing it. We should be having more opportunities for young people, not less. And I think, you know, we should be having more youth apprenticeships. They've been going down in the last few years. I think we should be having as many young people going into apprenticeships as there are going to university. That is about opportunities for the future.
Shirley, I'll come to you, but Jill Kirby, what would you say to him?
I'd say, have you got a job at the moment?
I work part-time at the moment, but I'm at university because I want to get a degree and I want to try and see what I can do.
But about the general point that his prospects are grim for employment, for buying a house...
I think he's representing some of what I'm talking about as far as Gordon Brown's legacy is concerned, because there is no doubt that when you're dealing, when a huge chunk of public expenditure is going on paying interest on debt, not even beginning to pay debt down, that is not a good situation to put the citizens of this country into. It's not a good use of money. It need never have happened. You can't just say, oh, it was the banks. Gordon Brown made a lot of crucial decisions. No. He should have been. He told us that he had abolished boom and bust, that everything would go on being wonderful and he could get away with it, and he could not.
But the zero-hour contract is a problem now. That's not about what happened 5 years ago. It's about what happens now.
A 0 hours contract is better than no contract at all.
The Labour councils can do what they like.
It's better than no work at all.
Sorry, wait a minute. Yvette, Sajid just says that Labour councils offer 0 hours.
Yeah, they can stop right now. Why don't you stop them?
Then some of them have been really squeezed.
No, why don't you stop them?
I think we should stop exploitative 0 hours contracts for everybody, not just for some people.
All right, Shirley Williams. Well, can you speak directly to his point about his future prospects?
I think he's much too gloomy. Let me give you 3 examples. First of all, at the very present time, Vince Cable is bringing to an end 0 contracts. Number 2, we have put out a big increase in the number of apprentices. Maybe not your line, but for lots of boys and girls who are 16, 15 and 16, it's an absolutely crucial step forward. Number 3, we're proposing in the new statement, which was made by the Chancellor, that there should be additional money for people who want to study to a higher level, for example, postgraduate. So you wanted to be, you have to show an interest in it, but then you can do that. Number 4, you will find that at the present time, for example, there are steps being taken to try to, above all, assist the North with a new Northern hub in getting really serious jobs in the professions, in science, right the way across the front. That's in the Chancellor's statement. Now, I'm not a total supporter. I think there are things that ought to be different and done differently. But you honestly are more gloomy than you have any right to be.
Okay.
Because there are some things going on and you can take advantage of them, in my view.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left, and there is an interesting question from Kathleen Cameron. And I'd like you to be brief, panel, if you would, on this. But, Kathleen, let's have your question.
Why should smokers and obese people be denied routine surgery because of their way of life?
This comes from the NHS in Devon, who've said that smokers and morbidly obese people will be told they're going to be denied routine surgery unless they stop smoking or lose weight. Is that right or fair? Omid?
Oh, please don't come to me.
Why not? You're not a smoker?
As an overweight person, I'm offended by that question.
But what do you think of it? You think they're right or wrong? They say they've got a 14.5 million deficit. They're not prepared to spend money on people who are obese or who smoke in terms of operations.
I think that's ridiculous. Why? Why? Just because they smoke? Sorry, I don't understand what the question is.
Okay.
Isn't it about getting people to take some responsibility for their own health? And if you want the operation enough and somebody's offering you the opportunity to have it, provided you give up smoking and cut a bit of weight down, then isn't that an incentive actually to take some care of yourself a bit better? I mean, how do you feel about paying for an operation, paying for operating tables to, you know, thousands of pounds, millions of pounds running in, to be spent making doors wider and operating theatres stronger because people are obese, when many of those people could actually take some part in reducing their weight. And, you know, unless we start being responsible for our own health, then we're never going to be able to afford to pay for the health service.
Sajid, is it right for the NHS to say they won't give people the services that,
no, I think that
are available?
A very important principle of the NHS is there for everyone when they need it. And you know, when someone's is unhealthy like that, and even if it's to do with smoking or obesity, they're going to need that help, but you should help them first, and of course work with them to try and bring about a healthier lifestyle. That's just as important.
All right, Yvette Cooper.
No, I don't think that people should be denied operations unless there's a really good health reason why, for some reason, maybe because of their weight, that actually the operation would be dangerous. But otherwise, unless there's a direct medical reason, I think this is completely wrong because, look, there's lots of people who are trying really hard to lose weight. There's lots of people who are trying really hard to give up addictions, people who've paid into the system over many years and paid for investment in the National Health Service. And I think the real problem that this shows is that you've got the National Health Service in different parts of the country that is feeling so squeezed now that after £3 billion reorganisation, after the scale of the pressures on them, with the ageing population, we need more support for our National Health Service. I think our National Health Service is in crisis and it shouldn't be allowed to just become a sort of excuses where you get rationing rather than have the support that we all want to see for the National Health Service. Is why we've said we put a mansion tax in, let's get the support in it needs.
Shirley Williams, very briefly, if you would.
Well, very briefly, we shouldn't forget some other things like mid-staffs. There have been some bad cases in the NHS under both parties, but I would say directly that it's absolutely crucial that we put more money into public health, and I think public health does mean, and here I agree with Jill, it does mean persuading people to be rather careful about their own health, because without it, frankly, the NHS will suffer.
But is it reasonable to say go away until you've lost weight, or go away until you've stopped smoking?
What is reasonable is to start right back with the kids in school and to explain to them that something like obesity, and it often starts at 4, should be dealt with at the earliest age. They should be persuaded this is not a good idea.
All right. I'm sorry, we've got people with their hands up and I've got to stop. I'll take a very quick point from you on the gangway there, in the blue pullover. Very brief, if you would.
It's also a lifestyle choice to go skiing for the week or drive fast cars. At what point do we decide what's a legitimate concern?
Well, you chose to go skiing, you've broken your leg, don't expect us to look after you, I mean. Yes. OK. Right, well, thank you very much for that. And pertinent point, and we have to stop now, because our hour's up. We're going to be in Canterbury next week.
Eat less.
Eat less, everyone. On our panel, we've got two rather contrasting critics of Westminster. We've got Nigel Farage and Russell Brand. That's in Canterbury next week, and if we survive that, we'll be back in Watford on January the 8th, because we're taking a break for Christmas. Now, if you want to be in the audience for the Canterbury programme or the Watford programme, the address is there on the screen to apply to, or you can call 0330 123 9988. If you're listening on 5 Live, as you know, this debate will continue on Question Time, Extra Time. But from Doncaster, my thanks to our panel here and to all of you who came to take part in the programme. Until next Thursday, with those 2 firebrands, good night.
Former model Caprice explains what should we be ashamed of this week. Follows next on BBC One.
Why do some people stay in abusive relationships?
As a new law could soon criminalise psychological and emotional abuse, Panorama